X-Men Volume 5. So I have finally reached the end of X-Men, the animated series. Classic in really like the comic book, cartoon world. And it was a cool final volume, but there was a lot of crazy stuff that went on in this final one. And I mentioned this in my last review that things were really weird, and it was like some stuff is like very odd and out of order. There's a lot of stuff with Jean where it's like, Jean, is she dead? Is she not dead? Because I couldn't remember from the other volumes because I'd seen them so long ago. But it would be like some episodes they talk about, it was like some episodes it was like the wedding thing, and then other episodes nobody's there, and they're, that's kind of just a normal TV thing where like characters disappear. But normally when it's an animated series, especially the X-Men, it was just like a lot of people were missing all the time in the other episodes. And then this one really made it crazy because this is around the time when they started to switch animation up. And it was literally for the last couple episodes. I think there were a total of, I believe, 8 episodes. So the last 5 episodes completely were done by a different animation team than the rest of the entire series. And then there are 2 other episodes, I believe on the first disc, that were done by a different animation team as well. And you knew it was going to be different because the theme was different. So it would be the normal X-Men theme that everyone pretty much knows and loves, and that would be the normal animation. And then they did one episode and the theme was really different. I was like, oh, that's a weird time to change up the theme. Like, in the last volume there's like 10 episodes left. And, not even 10. There was like, well, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so yeah, actually there were about 10 episodes left. I just thought that was weird. I was like, this is a really weird time to change the theme now at the end of the series. And then I was like, the animation is also super weird because the first time they did it, I noticed it because the first person they showed was like Jubilee. And what they did is instead of her having like her goggles and stuff, she doesn't have her goggles anymore and she has like long hair. And pretty much not until like the very last episode, she doesn't ever have like her, basically her raincoat looking jacket on. It would be like there's one episode where she was like with a bunch of kids and she was stuck like babysitting basically and taking them through like these caves and stuff. So she was in like excavation gear because it was super hot and it would make sense. And then another episode she was with Beast and they were off in like Mayan jungles and stuff. So once again it was like super hot. So it was always like every time they put her in an episode, it was like, oh, it would be super hot. So this is like her new costume, and it was almost like normal clothing, and it had like, she'd have the X on it or something. And I was like, that's interesting how they kind of did that. And the animation is very noticeable for sure. It's like insane it's impossible not to notice the difference. I think Jubilee looked the most similar, outside of the fact that they gave her longer hair and they took away the goggles and stuff. But Beast, you could tell he looked different. Wolverine actually may have been the one that looked the most the same. But it was kind of cool because in one aspect, it was a bit more fluid. And that was the thing that I really liked about it. But at the same time, there was some serious differences where the characters sometimes just looked really different. Like, Rogue isn't like, everyone's in the final episode, so you get to see all the characters in the new animation style. And Rogue looks super different. Like, she normally has like the really, sort of like curly hair, and like they're just a bunch of curls if you look at her hair. And this was almost like super anime like, which makes a lot of sense because it was Saban, like Power Rangers and stuff. So it made sense that it was very anime esque. And instead of like all the bunch of curls and stuff like that, it was very kind of straightforward. It almost made me think of Sonic, how he has like whatever that is that he has, like, kind of the tendrils or something. It kind of made me think of that, where it would be like long strands of hair instead of like all the little curls. And it wasn't like obviously the most detail ever, even in the old volumes, but it was just more to it. And so you could really tell the difference. Gambit had a different voice actor. Like the first episode they did the animation change, Gambit was in it, and it was like, oh, that's totally a different voice actor. But you get used to it because he's in, I think, like 3 of the episodes, and like closer to the end of the episode it sounds like the old guy. And I don't know, maybe it was the older guy in the very last episode, but it was just a lot of stuff. And I looked up a bunch of things after it ended, and I was like, man, it was kind of an anticlimactic ending. Like, seriously, the last volume is kind of just like, it's a little weird, especially the last episodes, because it has like, they're pretty much all sort of episode of the week things where like they don't really tie into much. They aren't like big story arc things. There are 2 in here. So we have the Phalanx Covenant Part 1 and 2, and then Stormfront Part 1 and 2 is on disc 2. So those are clearly meant to be, like, good story-based episodes. They're two-parters. And then everything else is kind of just like, here's an episode, here's an episode. One that I really want to talk about, which I got some information on after I was reading a bunch of stuff up and, like, all these weird changes and stuff, is No Mutant is an Island. And this is episode 66 out of the series. And the craziest thing about this is, because of the whole animation deal and how money was being lost, and this is during the time, like, the final volume is during the time when Marvel was going bankrupt, so that's kind of why Saban took over, and that's why it went to a different animation studio and stuff. Along with some of the weird animation things they were doing, and even just when they were doing the deals, episodes were thrown way out of order. And so there's this episode called No Mutant is an Island. And this episode was supposed to air like 2 years before this volume. And when I watched it, it made no freaking sense. And I was like, this makes no sense, because the whole episode, you go through it and everything, and then you get to the end of the episode, and it's like, it's Jean. She's alive. And I was like, what the F is going on? Because I just watched, in the last volume, a bunch of episodes where it's like, oh, there's, Scott and Jean having the wedding when they fought Apocalypse, and Sinister came to kidnap them, and all this other stuff. And I'm like, it was so confusing going through it. I'm like, I do not know if she's dead or alive. I was so confused. And then I read this article where it's like, that episode was supposed to air as a part of her coming back to life. That was supposed to be like the first episode after the Dark Phoenix saga. That was supposed to be the episode that played, because it just made sense. But instead, they were playing episodes as they finished instead of playing them in the order they should have been aired. And so this episode is like 2 or 3 volumes in, because I think, like I mentioned, it's 2 years. I think the Dark Phoenix saga, I think that may have been volume 3, the Dark Phoenix saga. And this was supposed to be the episode of her coming back to life, where it's like, oh, she's not dead. She's actually alive, and not a cosmic entity inside of a diamond in space. She's actually alive. And that, it was following the comic book storyline and everything. But when it showed up, I was like, I do not understand. I'm so confused. And like I said, I'd forgotten that she died, and it makes sense now. And maybe there is an episode that did play at the right time where it showed how she came back, but I don't think it did. I mean, I'm assuming there was some episode where it's like they found her again and she was officially alive, but it was so crazy. Like, No Mutant is an Island, 2 years late, and it's just like, she's alive. It was like, they shouldn't have even played that episode. Like, I mean, they spent the money on it, so I guess, but it was the weirdest little thing that randomly happened. But the last 5 episodes, the animation is completely different, 100%. They have all the characters come back towards the end. At least all the X-Men do. And Morph comes back, who's in, like, the first episode, who gets, like, really effed up and stuff, and he kind of goes nuts. And he shows up a little later in the series as well, and he comes back at the very end. He looks totally different because of the animation. Like, he's, like, sort of scrawny and stuff, and he has, like, black hair. When he's in the final episode, his hair isn't even black. It's like completely brown. I was like, he does look different. He looks like a totally different person. And it was just weird how they did it. But the final volume was still entertaining to watch. It was just a lot of, here's just an episode. Because another thing that I found out is that the show is actually supposed to end after the last volume, where they did the Apocalypse storyline, which was like 5 parts, where it was all the X-Men together. And this was the thing where Sinister came to kidnap he came to kidnap Jean, not Scott. And it was like, Apocalypse was trying to use all the telekinetic people, all the psychics and stuff, to basically create his own version of the universe. That was supposed to be the end of the series, where they beat Apocalypse, which makes perfect sense. They kill off Apocalypse, and then they disband, and that was supposed to be the ending, but Fox wanted more episodes, so it was like, oh, okay, and they just made more episodes. And some of them came out good, like, we have part 1 and part 2 of Stormfront and the Phalanx comic. Those were pretty good, especially the, I barely remember the first disc, to be totally honest. I remember, like, the last couple episodes. But the Stormfront thing was pretty cool. But everything else was just like, here's just an episode. They have Jubilee's Fairy Tale Theater, where she made up her own fairy version of the world, and she's, like, the hero, and Logan is, like, an orc and stuff, and Magneto is, like, the villain, and he has a bunch of knights that are kind of dressed in his clothing and stuff like that. And it was a fine episode. It was just like, this is clearly just sort of a random filler thing. Then they had an episode called The Fifth Horseman, and that was about Apocalypse coming back to life. And I have no idea why they made that episode at the end of the series. Like, oh, Apocalypse actually is coming back to life. And he comes back to life at the end, and he takes over a character who was in an older episode, the Asteroid M stuff. And it's like, oh, okay. But we got like 3 episodes, and clearly nothing happened. They just brought it, like, Apocalypse is alive again inside of a person's body. And that was it. I was like, I don't know. Then, oh my goodness, they had this episode called Descent, I believe. It was either Descent or Hidden Agendas. It was seriously just, let's make a 1800s version of Xavier. It wasn't even all the X-Men, because I was like, oh, this is going to be like all the X-Men are going to be like 1800s, old Victorian style. It was just Professor X and Mr. Sinister, and it's like, oh, it's Professor X, and he's telling the story of the 1800s version of Mr. Sinister, and how Mr. Sinister became Mr. Sinister in the 1800s because he wanted to save his wife by basically being Mr. Sinister and furthering genetic mutations and stuff like that. And I was like, this is almost a dumb episode. It wasn't even, like I said, the fairy tale thing they did with Jubilee, they at least put a bunch of people in. And then this was like, it's only Professor X. I thought it was going to start off as kind of like, I thought it was going to be sort of a, I can't even think of the guy's name, Sherlock Holmes. That's what I thought it was going to be like. And it's like, oh, there's someone killing people. And I thought it was supposed to be like Jack the Ripper, and they were going to do sort of an X-Men version of that, where they try to stop Jack the Ripper or something. And it would be kind of Sherlock Holmes stopping Jack the Ripper, but they'd all be like, X-Men characters. And it was just Professor X telling a story about this 1800s alternate version of Mr. Sinister, and how he wanted to save his wife, and then he kind of went crazy and turned himself into Mr. Sinister. And in the end of the episode, Professor X tracked him down, but he was a little too late, and all he had was this book that Mr. Sinister wrote some stuff in. It was The Origin of Species by some famous dude. I hardly paid attention. I was like, this is just like a dumb episode. So there's one. That was one. And then a great episode was Old Soldiers, which is like based on the cover right here, and that's Wolverine and Captain America. That was actually a pretty cool one, and it was really simple. It was Wolverine, it was Captain America, they're fighting together. This is sort of old style, so it wasn't Wolverine as a part of the Howling Commandos, which is something they've kind of retconned and a billion other things. And it was also one of the things that made me wonder when the cartoon took place as far as the story of Wolverine. And, there's an old time where Wolverine's claws weren't a part of his body. They were, like, a part of the costume. And so I was like, when I saw this episode, there's a part where he's fighting with Captain America, and he uses claws. And I was like, I don't know if he did that because he was hiding it, and it was just like a play, and he was acting like he didn't have the claws, or if it was like a part of the story where he didn't have the claws. But in the episode, he does use them outside of, he doesn't have like the gloves or anything. He actually has them. So I think around that time, that was when they did it, where he got the claw. It was before the bone claws, but he got the claws from the Weapon X program. Like, they made, like, the story in the old story, which I never actually knew this, is that they made the claws inside of his arm and stuff like that, and that was the part to just make him a better weapon. There's a million they changed so much stuff with Wolverine, doesn't matter at this point, but it just made me curious when I saw. I was like, so he doesn't have the metal claws, so this must have been, I was just really curious. I was like, is this before they even said those were his claws in general? But I'm like, I've definitely seen him use the claws outside of, wearing the costume. So I was just a little confused at the time. But I think it was in between the bone claw thing and the original him not even having claws for real. So I just thought that was interesting watching it. But pretty cool. I got to see Wolverine with Captain America. Got to see the Red Skull. And it was just a little story of Wolverine trying to figure out, what happened during this old mission and why he was betrayed by the person that he and Cap were meant to save. And he kind of finds some things out later on. And, they fight Red Skull and stuff like that. Simple episode, pretty fun. It's Cap and Wolverine just fighting. There's like a little scene at the very end when the Howling Commandos do show up, though. So I thought that was cool. It's like, oh, it's the Howling Commandos, but it was before they did it where Wolverine actually joined Cap and the Howling Commandos, because that's one of my favorite things about his character. That they kind of, I don't know if how it's been, I don't know how that story started, but I think that was always a part of it, that he at least knew Captain America, and I think he always ended up joining them. Because if you watch X-Men Evolution, that's like one of the big episodes, is they find Captain America, and this is before he even wakes up, he's still frozen or something. And it's like he goes through the history of him as a part of the Howling Commandos. So that's always in there. They had that in Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes. They had Wolverine in there. They didn't actually show him. It was like a silhouette. I was like, oh, that's cool. They threw the Wolverine cameo in there because he was a part of the Howling Commandos at some point. So that was just a cool episode to see. But fun final volume. Just really crazy. It was just wild because of all the animation stuff, and especially like I said, the episode that aired 2 years late, and it's like, it just confused me. I don't know if that was the case with the last volume either. I think that was just Jean was already alive, and she just wasn't showing up, and like I said, I just forgot what happened. But maybe that's why. Maybe they didn't do an episode where she came back to life, and maybe they did, and I just forgot. But that's definitely not a good help. Where it's like this random episode, it's like Jean's alive, and I'm like, whoa. What? I don't understand. I'm so confused. But it's the end of the series. It definitely has, its good moments in there. Excuse me. Outside of, it being sort of a meh kind of ending, and the actual final episode isn't really bad. I actually like the final episode, and the way they play it is Professor X is basically dying, and the ending scene is actually really good. The ending scene was great, where he's saying his final words. He made Wolverine like cover his face because he cried. I was like, you did something when Wolverine cried. So I was like, this is actually a really great moment. And like I said, they brought Morphin. They had Magneto in. They actually had Sunfire come in, who I honestly only remember because I used to play his character a lot in X-Men. X-Men Legends 2. I don't know why he always stood out, but I guess I just liked his powers. And he has a very unique costume. But he was in it, and they had Magneto in it and stuff, and I was like, this is it was a great ending during that last little moment, and everybody's crying and stuff like that, and it's like they feel like they're watching their final moments of Professor X, and of course he ends up getting saved at the end. But not physically. It's like his spirit his spirit kind of has to leave his body, and he's saved by Leandra or something like that. She's like an alien, the Shi'ar thing and other stuff. Forgot who she was, really. I remember when they said the name, I knew who she was, but I just can't remember her exact position. She's like the queen or the princess of an alien race that is really important during like the Phoenix Saga. That's really her when she first shows up. But she comes in and she saves him, but he's like, he doesn't just heal. It's like we have to take him away for a while, and basically his consciousness he could use because he's telekinetic to talk with all the X-Men, but he goes off in the ship basically at the end, and it kind of just ends where everyone is there and they watch the ship go off, and that's the end of the series. And it was kind of like, it was sort of that weird ending, which like I said was very clear, because it was just kind of like, it still worked as an ending, but it was still kind of like, man, this doesn't seem as epic as it should be. And it's probably because within this pretty much the entire final volume, it was just like, here's an episode. So there wasn't anything leading up to the finale where it's like, oh, we have like an epic, even just 2-part event, ending the series. It was seriously all the random episodes, and then the final episode was just by itself. It was just a single 30-minute episode. So it wasn't one of those things like most series would have, where it's like, this is the end of the series, let's make this story happen, where this goes down, and then it leads to this second episode, and then it leads to the third episode as the finale of not only this mini arc, but the entire series as a whole. It was just, here's an episode, here's another episode, here's an 1800s crappy episode. I really didn't like that one. Here's Apocalypse coming back to life at the very end of the series for some stupid reason. Here's a random fantasy episode for no reason. So just a bunch of one-off episodes that were kind of okay. Like the Old Soldiers was really good. The fantasy one I actually did end up enjoying, but it was just like, that's all it is to it. And then they had like, like I said, the 2-part things, but it just kind of fell apart at the end. They just did random episodes. The animation thing was noticeable, but it didn't bother me. It was just, they clearly just wrote the stories like, well, here's an ending, and that was it. So it was like, it kind of sucked that that's the way this amazing series ended, where they've had, they took like the greatest story arcs from the X-Men franchise. They did, Days of Future Past, you know, Cable and Bishop and his sister during the Apocalypse thing. They had, all of them. That I kind of wish it ended there, or they could have done something else. But that was epic. And like I said, it makes sense that that should have been the ending, because it was like a 5-part event, and it was Apocalypse, all the X-Men, Mr. Sinister, Magneto, Mystique. I don't remember. I don't think Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch showed up, and I think they showed up a little later. But they had so much stuff going on. And like I said, like 5 freaking parts. It would have made sense that that was the ending, and then still a good final episode, mostly because of those final moments, because nothing happened. There was a bunch of talking like the whole episode, because Professor X was dying. But that final moment kind of made up for like the whole thing kind of being a sort of it was like a very mediocre end to a great series. But that final moment was just so good, with everyone tearing up and stuff in the speeches. And like, they had a great moment when he's talking to everyone, and instead of saying, a bunch of stuff to Beast, like he said to everyone else, he makes a quote, which is what Beast does through the whole series. He makes a bunch of quotes that relate to the situation. And of course, Professor X is the perfect person to do that with Beast there. And he just says a quote, and he doesn't say who it's by, so if you don't know, you just don't know. And I was like, that was just great writing. Like, that ending moment where he gives these final words to all these characters. And, like he said to Scott, it was like, you're not my son, but if you were, if I were your father, I'd tell you were like, there's no greater son anyone could bear, or something like that. And I was like, dang, that's a crazy, great. It was just amazing dialogue, and like that made up for like the whole just one-off sort of ending episode. I was like, just that ending with the sad dialogue, and even if he got saved, it was just like just that ending dialogue where he talked to everyone and what he thought were going to be his final moments was just great to me. I was like, it was just crazy. I was like, I just love this dialogue so much. I can ignore that this is just poof, here's the final episode. So it did kind of make up, just the way they wrote it. It definitely worked for me in those final moments. I loved those final scenes. But it was, officially a good way to end the series as a whole. It's just the episodes before it, It was just like, it was sad that everything was just, here's a one-off thing, here's stuff that shouldn't, 2 years out of order, and Apocalypse coming back at the end of the series, which I wish they just really didn't do, because they beat him and it annoyed me. Like, they brought him back, and I know this won't come up at the end, and of course I was right, but still enjoyed it. Of course, if you guys happen to have seen it recently, would love to know what you thought about it, so please comment below. Let me know favorite final episodes, least favorite final episodes, hated that 1800s thing, but want to know what you guys thought about some of the last episodes that you guys can remember from the X-Men. And of course, especially with this being the final one, thank you guys for watching.